Hello, this is Tom at Tools and Trade, and welcome to my shop. Today we're going to talk about reading wood, and it's so critical that if you're to work with the product, you're going to need to understand about the product, which is wood, and its principles, what it does, what it doesn't do, and I'm here to let you know. I'm here to bring you up to speed from what I see and how I understand wood myself, being a woodworker most of my life. Anyway, I'm starting out with a log here, and a log that's, we're looking at the growth rings, and now this is the way majority of our lumber is milled, especially the stuff you get at Home Depot or Lowe's. It's just flat sawed, and it's like a lot of, you'll see like band saws that are used out in the field or even at the sawmill where they're just cut layer after layer after layer. Okay, what I'm wanting to bring up in this picture is that we have what we call a smiling face down here, and this is the frowning face up here. Now both boards are basically the same. You can get a frowning face out of a smiling board. It's just depending upon which way it's flipped. So what I'm going to talk about, let me get my little pen here, is that, let's say for instance you're doing a deck and you got a board right here for the deck. Now you got to put, this is, let's say your 2x6, 8, 10, or 12, whatever the board you've got to nail your boards on. So we're going to put a board here, another board here, another board here, and another board here. Okay. Now, which way would you put these boards? Now there's a right and a wrong way, and I'm going to tell you what we want to do is have all smiling faces right here on this board, and there's a reasoning for this, and I'll tell you. A smiling face board will actually start curving down on the ends. And the reason why you want to do that on a deck is that you don't trip or step your foot. If this board was to bow up over its time on your deck, that could trip you. So if you're really a good carpenter and you know how to read wood, then you'd say, I don't need a frowning face up there, I need a smiling face. And the rule of thumb is that if you see the grain going this way, it actually operates in a behavior of the opposite. So if you think of this board cupping and going more that way, you're wrong. It's going to do the opposite. So I always say, if I do the opposite, then that's what's really going to happen. Okay, another thing I want to draw, now that's for deck where you want nothing but smiling faces. Now if you're to make a tabletop where you're using a bunch of lumber, I'm going to show you how you do that one. Okay, we'll even make it a little longer. Okay, there's 4 boards there. Now when you choose the boards, a lot of times people just say, oh, just put your boards up pretty side up. It doesn't work that way. If we already know that a smiling face will go to frowning on the edges, then you have to say, if I did nothing but smiling faces for a tabletop, that means that this frowning on one board and a frowning on another board and a frowning on another board, you're going to have your tabletop become bowed. All because you didn't do this properly. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a smiling face, then we're going to do a frowning face, then we're going to do a smiling face, then we do a frowning face. Why? Because when this board bows down, this one's going to bow up, and this one's going to bow down, this one's going to bow up. And by having them, every other board done differently, then every board works against each other to help keep a straight tabletop or a straight bunch of boards that you might make anything out of if you're just needing it. So it's so critical to do that. And I'll give you an example. I went to Home Depot and looked for treads. And here we go. I'm going to show you something. Okay, what we see here is the smiling face, the frowning face, and the smiling face. This is just like this right here. It's alternating the growth rings to keep the board straight. Now, I had to look through a lot of these in order to find this one right, but I feel that these are assembled by a robotic computer and not by a person saying, oh, well, we need to do it this way. So anyway, it's so critical and important to do this if you want your tabletop to be as flat as you can make it and straight. Another thing we want to talk about being that reading wood can go from framing houses into cabinet maker, furniture making, furniture restoration, which is what I've done a lot. That's how I've seen the behaviors of wood over 100, 200, 400, whatever years that the piece is. So let's just go to the framing job and say that you've got a board here. It's a 2x6, 8, 10, 12. It's a rafter. It's a floor joist. It's a ceiling joist. Now, usually when you look down a board, you want to see what's called the crown. There's one side that's going, if you look on the end, that's going to go up or going to go down. So you always want what they call crown up. And the reasoning why is that you put a crown board on a floor joist in a house or a ceiling joist, when you put the weight of the floor or the sheetrock on it, it's going to pull it down by gravity. So if you have the bow crown going down, now you're not setting the board up to maximize its strength and its ability. The strength is to have the crown up. I don't know if you've driven down the highway and seen a tractor trailer truck and the bed is arched, especially the new ones. I mean, they're severely arched, but that means that the arch has strength in it. So they're doing that so they can heavily load it, and those arches compress a little bit, but not as much as, I mean, they're very obviously that they're arched, and that's for strength purposes. So even to utilize a floor joist, a rafter, a ceiling joist, any of these boards need to be crowned up. So that's important. Another thing is what I've seen is when you're cutting wet wood, let's say pressure treated lumber, it's a little too wide, so you need a shorter board. So what you do is you take the board and you cut into it, and then you find out that this board here starts going like that. You know what caused that? This board is, being that it was pressure treated, let's say it's full of chemicals to keep it from rotting and be good for being outside. Okay, all this outer area has been dried and it's fairly consistent, the whole thing. Now when you rip or put it on a table saw and you cut right into here, this edge for a little piece is going to be wetter than the outside. So what a wetter surface does is it expands. So that's why it's going to make this board bow like this. So I'm trying to get you to understand why things do the way that they do. And if you understand it, then you can be a wood detective. And if you're a wood detective, then you're just that much closer to being a good restorer or a craftsman, because you're understanding your product. Another thing is that I just taken a sponge, it was a dry sponge, and I put it in water just a little bit, and I was having the wet side expand much faster than the dry side. Same way with wood. That's why if you lay your wood down on grass or earth, I mean, even like when you're framing, no problem, it's straight. But you're letting all that moisture from the ground come up only on that one side. Then the sun's baking the top, so You got a dry side with the sun and a wet side from the earth. Or even sometimes in your warehouse and you say, I'm going to place it on the floor. A lot of concrete will have moisture come up from the earth, and there's what's called a moisture barrier, where they put a piece of like black plastic down before they pour concrete to keep the moisture from coming up. So sometimes you can be in trouble by just laying your boards flat on the concrete slab of your shop, because that side's going to be wetter and have more moisture because of what's coming up through the slab that you're unaware of. Anyway, so pay attention. You know, sometimes you might need to rotate it or put your, the main thing is to turn around, and if you're going to put your boards on concrete, put them on some other short boards that can keep it off the ground. You know, wood is very temperamental. I mean, if there's a wetter side and a drier side, you're going to see some warpage behavior. And so anyway, that's key and that's important. Another thing is what we're talking about on moisture is one time I went to a client's Park Avenue apartment in Manhattan in the dead of winter, and they had an English dining room table that had just arrived a week or two earlier, and they were talking about that a table leaf was bowing on the end. I mean, all the way through the table leaf. And they wanted me to fix it. And I said, wait a minute, I just feel that this apartment is way too dry. And I feel that's what's causing this problem that you have with your table leaf. And I explained that England, oh, you think of all the, you know, the daily rain. So, you know, London is like foggy, more moisture out there. And then you take it into a New York City apartment, which has a radiator steam heat. Now, a lot of them have a tin box around them and to kind of make them more decorative. And if you lift the lid up or hinge it back, you see sometimes a cookie sheet right at the top, and that's supposed to have water poured into it in the wintertime so that that steam heat that's drying out your apartment and everything in it is then going to put some of that moisture back into the air. So I told these people, I said, what you need to do is go get you one of these guys. Now, this is a hair hygrometer based upon your hair, real sensitive. We've had a lot of rain, so we've got a lot of moisture. That's why it's reading high. But it's so critical to know if your bow is because you got the growth rings wrong, or you didn't, or that if you have too dry of a climate or too wet of an environment. So I told these people to get a hygrometer. And what I used to do in my own little shop in my apartment in New York was that I had a small humidifier, but I'd go to Radio Shack and get a 24-hour timer. And the 24-hour timer was so that I punched every other button on out of the 24 buttons so that it would be on for an hour, off for an hour, on for an hour, off for an hour. So this way I wasn't a slave to my humidifier and said, oh, I'm at the shop, so I better plug it in. Oh, I'm leaving, I better unplug it. This thing is, it's better to not have a flood of either too much of a period of dryness or too much of a period of too much moisture. So I found that it freed me, gave me twice as much leeway, because it would be like a central air conditioner system where it was on for a while and then off once it really assured that if I've got a client's piece into my shop, that I'm not going to hurt it because I'm not being respectful of the proper humidity that's needed, especially like in the winter time. So pay attention to, get you one of these guys and you're not going to be guessing the moisture content anymore. Okay, another thing is when people, there's what's called a floating panel, and you're going to see this very typical in people's kitchen cabinet doors. Okay, there we're gonna have just a frame around it. Okay, now that's somebody's kitchen cabinet doors. Let's say you could put a handle right here and hinges here. Okay, basically this is where you've got wood, let's say the grain going this way. Now, this only applies to, like, solid wood, like solid pine, solid hardwood, but plywood does not shrink because the grains are crisscross, so they're very stable. But normally these panels are traditionally made out of solid wood, either soft or hardwood, which can expand and can contract and shrink. Okay, this is in a dado right here in this frame, and it's not to be glued or nailed in. And some people nail them in or say, "Oh, it's just too loose. I gotta shoot some, brads in it and slow it down, stabilize it." And I go, you're gonna get into trouble, because if you're to glue or nail that down, if this panel was to shrink, it's gonna split right here in the middle, because it can't just shrink all together in one piece. You've now connected the sides, and now when it dries it's going to split in half, and you're going to have two separate panels, which isn't a good thing. So you even have to watch when people paint kitchen cabinet doors over and over and over again. Paint gets down here into these gaps and then act just like it's got glue in it. So you've got to be aware of that. And floating panels can also be like when you've got a colonial, 1700 library of Thomas Jefferson or something, and that you see this beautiful architectural woodworking, but these big square panels, and a lot of that is just floating panels. That's so that all that big, massive amount of wood can expand under high humidity and shrink. And even with this cabinet door, a lot of times when they shrink, you're going to see unstained wood on either side where the panel has shrunk so much. It's going to show you where they didn't put the stain or the finish. And a lot of times when they're building new kitchen cabinet doors, they'll go ahead and stain this panel before they put it in. So this way, when it does shrink in the future, it won't be so obvious of having two little strips of raw wood from where it's collapsed. So anyway, floating panels can also be in a drawer bottom of an antique. They can actually be in the side panels of a piece of furniture, and they can actually be on the back of a piece of furniture. So be looking at floating panels. And even like an antique drawer bottom, they only put two nails at one end of the panel, so this way it's always going to expand and contract from where it's been anchored. Now, if you anchor it on the other side, then that's what's going to cause it to split. So you just don't ever do that. And if you look at an old antique drawer, there's a dado on the sides and a dado on the inside of the front of the drawer for this drawer bottom to rest on. So pay attention to that in the future. Another thing to think about is that when they do hardwood floors, let's just draw like little boards. Like when you're doing a tongue and groove oak floor in a house. Anyway, what you need to be aware of is that wood never changes dimensions from end to end. A board never gets longer or shorter, but a board will get wider under high humidity or skinnier under dry. And it'll actually, throughout its life, it'll just keep getting skinnier, skinnier, skinnier. So with that in mind, that if you're putting down 3/4 inch tongue and groove oak floors, for instance, and you got a baseboard here, you want to leave a little gap of space here, and then one on the other side of the room. So this way there's a little gap, and you could make the flooring go underneath the baseboard and then under the quarter round or the shoe molding, so this way you don't see this gap space. Sometimes they would fill it with cork, so that the cork could be soft enough that it could be compressed under these boards swelling, and then also that the cork would move back out when it started to dry. And if you did butt your hardwood floor from baseboard to baseboard, you're going to see it pop up. And I've seen plenty of that, and it can be stopped by just having you have some space on either end. Now, being that wood does not change from end to end, these boards won't get longer or shorter. They can actually touch the baseboard here and here, because that won't be an issue. And always be sure to have some type of moisture barrier underneath your hardwood floors, like I'm old school. Tar paper, for instance, is what we used before. We had a lot of plastics as far as, but you want to keep the moisture from coming up from the bottom, because then if that happens, then you're going to have the bottom of the board moist, which will swell, and the top dry, which will shrink. Then you have your board's looking like this, little cupping action. So it's so critical to know how to take care of that. And another thing is let's say if you're making a round tabletop and you're using solid pine, oak, maple, elm, walnut, pecan, and let's say that's your round tabletop with the boards like this. Now, being an antique furniture restorer, I always like to have an idea about how old a piece is, or how much shrinkage that it's had in its life. So you can actually put a tape measure from this point here to this point here and get your reading of what that round tabletop was originally. Because remember, this board did not shrink its length. Okay, though, what you do then is measure from here to there, and you're going to find that this tabletop might be 3/4 to an inch skinnier than it is long. And to be thinking that 3/4 to an inch happened in its lifetime. And the older the piece is, and the more it could shrink. So it's so critical to be thinking about. Anyway, that's an idea about, like, when you're even looking at furniture like that. So what I'm going to do is clear the board so I can do some more. Bear with me while I clean the chalkboard. Anyway, you got to do that. If you're putting it on, you got to take it off. It's the yin and the yang. Okay, anyway, now we got a clear board, we can do a little more on it, okay? So, now I want to go into another piece of furniture that I'm going to show you later on, of how I took the warp out of it. It was about a 200-year-old dressing table, and it had its top. Okay, I'm just going to draw the inside of this dressing table once you open the door, or lift the lid up. So you've got, and here's a mirror. Hello. Anyway, this thing actually had a warp in it. Okay. And once I saw it, I knew why it caused this warp. And all it was is that this was made of mahogany. All this wood was going this way, including this piece of molding and this molding. The villains in this was these two boards going the other way. As I said, boards don't shrink from end to end. They don't change length. So these were the bad guys, even though they look good and they're important for the piece. So when this piece shrunk, these two were at the inside of the drawer, the lid, staying their full length, and the rest was warping. So this is the board warping, shrinking at the top, and this is the board going lengthwise. So that's what was causing this to have problems. And so what I actually had to do was take the warp out of this, but I took these two pieces off and I actually had to shorten them down because they were too long for the amount of size that this top had been at this point. So later on, I'm going to show you that one. Another one I had was a beautiful French game table. Now, French game table, they played, I don't know if they played dominoes, but I know they played chess. So, you know, here's the thing. This is you'll get to see this picture later on when all this basic board was going this way, okay? And so where they messed up was that they did the tic-tac-toe for playing chess on it, right? That's beautiful. But where they messed up was that they put the veneer going this way on every one of these. So, you know, if you did it on all these surfaces, then you end up having the problem of that. Now the top is, the grain is the opposite direction. Now, if they had just turned around and made those veneer pieces of these little inlay go this way with the wood, they wouldn't have had as much of a problem. I mean, and sometimes even being that you've got it veneered on one side and not on the other, that can be an issue too. But this was the culprit, which is when they just put the veneer in the wrong way. So anyway, let me take off a little bit so I can draw a little bit more. Hang in there. So anyway, there's another piece that I'll show you. I've got a lot of history of fixing warps, and just, you know, it really helps to understand. So I did this beautiful, I'm trying to think of, then it goes into like, and then it's just like, and then it does this. And this is actually, I mean, I'm real crude drawing. This is a bonnet that fits on a secretary that has a bunch of shelves in here and with a cabinet door. Okay, the problem is the bonnet that I'm talking about is just this piece on top. All the grain is going this way of pine underlayment. The main frame of this piece right here is pine, and the grain is going this way. Here's where they messed up. They veneered the veneer going up and down like that. Okay, first of all, softwood grows faster than hardwood, and it also shrinks more than hardwood, and it shrinks faster as well. So to have pine going this way and then put like walnut wood going up and down, even though it's very thin, that caused this piece to bow back. This is pine that shrunk, and this is that long pieces of veneer. At one time when it was set up, this pine was fat and full and let it be perfectly straight up and down. So I actually had to cut this from the backside when it was really warped bad, several places with a very fine blade. So this way, when every one of those cuts opened up, I didn't want to start with a big cut and then have that big cut into a bigger cut, because it's now flattened. And every place that I cut it, I was actually adding a fatter piece of wood than the cut. So this way I was trying to bring the wood back up and to the same fullness that it had originally to support the veneer face. So remember that softwood shrinks more than hardwood, and here's a prime example. Okay, another thing, if you have like warped lumber, don't throw it away. Use it for smaller, shorter boards that you can use. Always, like when I'm looking through my lumber, I want to pick and choose, and I look through everything, and I want the best boards to either be the top or where I really need the fullness and the straightness of good lumber. And when it's not as good, then I can use it for smaller, shorter boards in a project. So bear that in mind. Anyway, another thing to think about is that you take a look at this board here that we talked about. You have, okay, that's a frowning, a smiling, and a frowning that works together. But also this board's been veneered on either side. And that's good because the veneer actually helps keep this actually a tread step for a staircase that they bullnose the edge right here. But it has an even amount of pull with this veneer on either side. And once you do the same on either side, you stand a better chance of that the board's staying true. And so if you were to only veneer one side, then there'd be more tension and pulling on the veneer side than the other side. So be sure and look at that. Another thing is when you do a finish on a board, it's good to put finish on both sides because like I had that client on Park Avenue in New York with the English dining room table leaf. The top of the table leaf was finished. Okay, the bottom wasn't. Now, the finish actually closes the pores and keeps the wood from breathing compared to the bottom of that leaf where I felt like the top's restricted, it's sealed, and now the bottom's open and it's a dry room, which means that it's going to dry out the bottom of that board and not the top. There's an inconsistency because it can't breathe at the same rate. So that's so important to think of that. If it's two-sided veneer, one-sided veneer, one-sided finish, two-sided finish, you know, so it's good to understand that. And it's another thing that also when you cut your lumber, like ripping it on a table saw, you want to turn around, providing that the board's already, cured or dried to its proper ratio. Then you also need to assemble it fairly quick because once it's ripped, especially ripped, not cross-cut, it's going to have a tendency to start thinking its own way of, oh, I need to do this, and now you need that straight board, so you go ahead and use it quick and anchor it, glue it in, clamp it down, and so pay attention to that. Another thing is let's take the woodworking guy doing the flooring guy for that inside of the house with the tongue and groove floor. I've seen numerous times where the flooring guy brings in the lumber and he nails it in place, and then there's a problem. The problem is that lumber's been in a warehouse probably under a lot more humidity than the house is. And so what happens is that when it gets into the drier environment, then once it's nailed and it's been nailed in place in the floor, right next to each other, but now they start shrinking because now it's in this drier environment, and then the floor is going to start having gaps between each hardwood plank, which this can be avoided by just bringing in the lumber like a week or so ahead of time and just let it just climatize, let it just pick up the same amount of moisture and dryness that's in the room. So this way it'll already be the fatness or the skinniness of the board that due to the climate that's in the house. So it's so important to understand that. Another thing is what I want to talk about is when you do a base. Okay, for instance, you have a square base on a table that the planks are like right out here. Okay, bear with me. So what happens is that this wood is in this grain direction, but this is a frame that's crossing the tabletop from underneath. This is actually to help put the base on or whatever. This is when I've seen wood screws just get bit. All the steel screw has such it's the power of the shrinking wood will dominate and bend your nails, or I mean bend your screws or even nails if it's put on that way. So you have to either, like when you drill the hole for in here, sometimes you drill it at an angle so this way the top can expand and contract but not be restricted by the screw. The screw can hold this frame down in place, but it's not going to turn around and break or hurt the piece. Got to always pay attention to that, because remember that's a floating panel as a tabletop by itself. Well, anyway, I've gone to a friend of mine's place and looked at his dying deck, and I actually photographed a frowning board that's put in it. I didn't build this deck. Anyway, and it's frowning, though you'll see it, the ears are popped up on it. Just like if it had been reversed to where it was smiling, then the ears being bent down would keep you from tripping. So anyway, take a look at that board. I mean, you'll see it and look at the gap, but look at where it was installed improperly on the deck. Another thing is, I went to a really good friend of mine who's an incredible craftsman, and we're going to meet him later on when we get into wood turning, and that's his specialty. So I went over there the other day and I was saying, yeah, I'm going to do a YouTube video on reading wood and talking about the growth rings, you know, and all. And he goes, oh yeah, it's so critical and so important, because he uses that as a wood turner, because he knows that wood will expand and contract with the grain, but not change from end to end. So when he does, like, let's say a hat, he wants that hat to go from round to oval so that it fits our oval head. But if you look real close, there's a bowl that he did, that's the first picture, and you're gonna see a hump. And that's where there's a growth ring, or what's called like the smiling, frowning face. But you'll see where it was smiling and the ears pulled down even on the lip of the bowl. So pay attention to that. And if you look at the hat that he did, he does excellent work, is that the hat is actually made to where it has kind of that bend in it, as well as the shrinking. And he paid all this attention to nothing but what I've just spoken to you guys about. You know, like I said, after this show, you can become a wood detective. And I mean, there's not a better feeling in the world as a woodworker that when you can understand what you're working with. And this way, when you see a problem with a piece of furniture like I've worked on, 100, 200, 300, 400, whatever, you're going to see the problems because people didn't do it right, or didn't, you know, or maybe they did the best that they could, but still you're gonna be able to understand where the problem comes from. Hey, I've enjoyed it. I hope you have too. I want you to come back and listen to more of my stories about tools and trade. I'm Tom saying goodbye. Thank you.